This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien kicks off today's show with a grain market outlook. He previews pre-report expectations of the world agricultural supply and demand estimates. Keeping the show rolling is K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato as he discusses winter wheat growing conditions and what scenarios growers might see in their fields to consider replanting. Chip Redmond, K-State meteorologist, ends today's show as he recaps the recent moisture all of Kansas received and if we can be expecting more. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, kicking off our conversation, talking about pre-report expectations for some USDA reports that will be coming out shortly after our conversation.
Yes, here at 11 a.m. Central, USDA will put out both the NASS report for crop production as well as the accompanying connected WASDE report, World Ag Supply Demand Estimate numbers that will give the supply demand balance sheets they're anticipating for these major crops, and there'll also be world ending stocks for corn, soybeans, wheat, others, and of course, big part of that foreign wise will be in terms of foreign supply demand will be all eyes on, again, Argentina, Brazil, and Canada also, then Russia and Ukraine for wheat. China also to some degree. But really probably the biggest numbers that we'll be looking at will be the crop production numbers for U.S. corn and for soybeans. The pre-report estimates, according to Reuters, as they've conglomerated or brought all that together, is that we're looking for an average of analyst estimates of 15.18 to 15.19 billion bushels. That'd be down just slightly from the October estimate of 15.203. And there's a range, though, just from about 15.1 billion up to 15.3. U.S. corn yield estimated to be down just a small amount, 183.7 bushels an acre versus 183.8 in October. There is, the lower end of the estimate range would be 182.5. And given that we're so tied in with kind of the reference yield that the market's expecting of 183.8, 183.7, anything that would be down from that appreciably would be a, quote, big deal. And then for soybeans, also the anticipation of yields being down about 0.3 of a bushel. This is the U.S. average yield down to 52.8 bushels an acre for the U.S. average. Total production, 4.55 or 4.56 billion bushels. That'd be down from about 4.58. So, here we're just clearly just cutting hairs, just getting small amounts. So there is the possibility of something outside of those very tight ranges. So we could see changes in production to the degree that it could change U.S. supply demand balance sheets. And just like we talked about for the production side, anticipation for the U.S. supply demand balance sheet actually in the markets to have ending stocks down about 45 million bushels. We've had some stronger exports than thought. U.S. ethanol production's been remaining strong, so that's good. Soybeans, anticipation of that being down about 18 to 20 million bushels, down to 532 million. I didn't say the corn number, about 1.946 billion. So the market is looking at something below 2 billion bushels. And if there is the lowest estimate in the range of about 1.83 billion. So if that comes in, that would lend support to the market. Top end range is about 2.1. So we'll see where that goes. And for world stocks to use typically just not much change in those things at all. Not much change anticipated for wheat, thought to be down about 1 million metric tons. You can say almost exactly the same thing, about down 1 million metric tons for corn for the November stocks estimate on the supply demand balance sheet for the world, and about 500,000 metric tons for soybeans. So a little bit lower. And those ending stocks numbers for the world are almost entirely dependent on what happens on crop size. So we'll be watching, what we've continued to watch, South American crops. Again, Argentina corn, Brazil corn. There's been some dry conditions in South Africa, so that could impact things for China and for Russia, especially for wheat. We've actually had a little bit better years than had been thought for Russian wheat, given some of the dryness that had come about. So I personally will be watchful for that. So we'll see where that goes. It's up a WASDE supply demand balance sheet coming out in large crop years in the United States, some variance overseas, and not really a lot of anticipation of major market change. So we're coming into this with the markets thinking that not much is going to happen. Well, if they get a surprise, then there is the possibility of volatility, especially if some of these production estimates come below expectations.
Dan, what are we currently seeing for futures?
Well, we have seen some small increases in some of these futures prices. Here we have corn, D's corn at $4.27, and that's up. It's over $4, and that's a big deal. It's up about a quarter from where it had been in the past, and we do see some carry from the D's to the March contract for corn, about 4 1/3 cents per bushel, but you don't see carry that's 5, 6, 7, 8 cents. That we're just, if we did, we'd say, well, gosh, we're just so awash in corn that the front end month has fallen off enough that, gosh, we're going to really reward storage going out to the future. Well, we're kind of moderately rewarding storage, and I'd say for corn right now that we had closed at the lowest for the lead contract in September at 385, so that we sit at about 427.5 now shows something about how usage has held up decently. Some exports have come into play, but particularly livestock feeding and ethanol has held up, so that's been supporting that market. Do you want to say something about grain sorghum within all that? Again, grain sorghum trades off of D's corn futures, and up and down movement for grain sorghum on a weekly basis, although we do have some, anticipation that China will come back in there and come back into that market and buy some. What we might talk about later is that, again, the possibility of U.S.-China trade tensions, that if there's one commodity that we have that would be most vulnerable to that, probably grain sorghum. When you look at wheat prices, we are at $5.69 yesterday for closes for the D's lead contract July at $5.98 3/4. We had been down to $5.27 for the lead contract for hard red winter wheat. So now that we're trading up to $5.69 has shown some improvement. And a variety of world factors coming into play. We keep hearing about the Russians rationing their usage, but so far for actual movement for hard red, we had a couple weeks that were pretty strong, but we've kind of settled back into a wait-and-see situation. I would say then for soybean prices, there's a surprise yesterday in the markets on Thursday the 7th, is that November soybeans closed at 10.15 and a half, up 21 cents. And we had been for beans down to about 9.55 as a low. Now here we've closed at again 10.26 1/4. So there's been some strength in all that. The last few weeks we've had pretty strong, really about 88, 89, 90 million bushels a week U.S. soybean exports, and we've got bought ahead. Well, basically about 1 billion bushels, plus that bought forward, and so we're 56% of the way to the USDA's projection. Now that may change in 45 minutes, but and we're only about 17% of the way through the marketing year. I would say pretty strong soybean meal exports and soybean oil exports too coming in to help support all that.
And Dan, wanting to mention those trade tensions that you talked about and what you're really kind of keeping your eye on there.
Coming out of the elections, we haven't, the presidential election earlier this week, we haven't seen a lot of traumatic change in the markets. There's been movement in the U.S. dollar a little bit higher as the stock market, for their set of reasons, responded positively to the results of that presidential election. And to the degree that leads to a higher U.S. dollar, well, that would tend to work against us on the trade side. A lot of concern, a lot of hand-wringing about what will happen in terms of U.S.-China trade and the anticipation of some aspect of renewal of tensions, standoff, whatever you want to call it, between the United States and China on trade restrictions. Again, who has tariffs now? Who doesn't? Are they going to try to take those tariffs down? That'd be the U.S. view of that. So we'll see where that all goes. Saw an article that Brazil, in anticipating that the U.S. and China may have trade tensions, discussions, whatever, that they're wondering about what they would see as the move of China towards them strongly, and that their stocks would be brought way down low, much lower. So, there aren't that many big players in some of those markets. Well, for soybeans in particular, for corn also, in terms of exporters. So if the U.S. and China do have trade tensions, this interplay between who comes to Brazil and who comes to the United States to buy soybeans will have to play itself out.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our grain market update.
Thank you, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Friday show talking about current winter wheat conditions and maybe if people are thinking about replanting, what they should consider with K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. It's great to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Romulo, as we're looking at current winter wheat conditions, what are we seeing across the state?
Shelby, conditions are quite variable around the state this year, right? If we look back in terms of the dynamics of precipitations, right, and the dynamics of rainfall that we had to get the crop established, it has been a really dry fall, right? It has been a fall where kind of there in early September, we had a few showers that came by, and that triggered some growers to plant out in the western part of the state. Actually, there was a very early planting for that part of the state, but still there was moisture in the profile, and some growers went out and did that. Then, really the remaining of September and most of October were very dry. Growers were actually dusting it in. Now, the challenge with that sometimes they were hitting partial moisture, and so the stems may have come up scattered, right? Some part of the stem come up wherever the seeds hit moisture, and parts of the stem not coming up at that point in time because simply it was in a dry part of the profile, or even worse, partially coming up because it may have hit just enough moisture to start the germination process, but not enough moisture to go through the emergence and establishment, and some of those seeds perishing, right? And so the conditions are very variable because of that. Very limited rainfall that led to early planting in parts of the state, and then later on, kind of like a hit or miss in terms of moisture, even within fields. Sometimes growers may have had moisture in the bottom part of the field, and that part may have come up, but no moisture in other parts of the field that may not have come up yet. Now, recently here, we had some precipitation come by for a lot of the state. And now we're talking November already, right? Like in the middle of October, there was a very light shower that came by kind of northwest and north central Kansas that helped some growers get some stems established. But again, the rest of the month was dry too, other than just recently now that we had some rain come across the state. Now, what's that going to do to our stems, right? If the seeds were planted on time, I mean, sometime during the month of September or October, and they were still there sitting and waiting to germinate, maybe they'll come up just fine, right? Maybe they'll just come up and still we're going to have a crop established in the fall. Perhaps not as many peelers as we would like, since it's a fairly late emergence. But as long as that seed is still viable, we might still have a nice stand from these recent rains here. Now, the concern is in fields where that seed perished, right? Again, maybe because of just partial germination and perishing just before it even came up. That may be driving growers to consider some replanting now in the next few days.
For growers, if they go out and look at that field, what are some things they might see that might encourage them to go replant their winter wheat?
Well, maybe the first thing to look when they're looking at that is what's the uniformity of that stand, right? Is the stand kind of like below optimal across the entire field, and that's fairly uniform? Then the growers can go out and dig those gaps and see if that seed is still coming up, right? Because chances are that seed is just now germinating after some of these recent rains, and so maybe we're still going to fill up some of those gaps. Also, if the gaps are fairly uniform across the field, the wheat plant can really peeler out quite a bit. And if it has resources in terms of fertility and temperature and moisture, right? And so chances are that if it's scattered but uniformly scattered stand, just a thin stand, the crop can still peeler out and compensate for a lot of that. Now, the issue becomes if there are large portions of the field, for example, that did not emerge, whether that was because of, again, dry conditions in the terrace tops or any other conditions that might have precluded the crop from emerging, then the decision of replant is easier, right? Because you just go to those portions of the field where the crop has not emerged yet, and after checking that it's really not emerging. If growers go out now and they are digging for seeds and that seed is emerging, so they can see the coleoxyle elongating, some radicals coming out of the seed, at this point, the recommendation is to just leave the stand be and not replant, right? Since those seeds might still make their way through the soil surface and can still have a stand established there.
What about if it just doesn't look like as many stands came up across the whole field as the growers feel like they should have?
So in that point in time, if they go out and, we have some, depending on the planting seeding rate the growers were using, the seed size of that seed, we have a table that we just published out that tells growers what the target plants per row foot that they should have, depending on their row spacing, right? And so, for example, if a grower is planting at 75 pounds per acre, and that seed is about 14,000 seeds per pound in terms of seed size at a 7.5 inch row spacing, they should have about 12 plants in a row foot. If they're well below that, right, that's kind of when they can consider planting or replanting that field, right? And then whenever replanting that field, the sooner they can go, the better, right? And trying to get still some of this moisture that is out there. There is always the potential that they're going to kind of damage a little bit those plants that are there already in the field. So kind of the recommendation is to try and go, if they have less than about 50% of where they want it to be, right? So they needed to have 12 plants in that row foot. If they have 6 plants in that row foot, then they are below that 50% stand roughly. Kind of the recommendation is that growers go and kind of replant that field at an angle, right? Maybe a 45-degree angle or something, so that we're minimizing the damage to the standing crop that is out there now. Since we're kind of just replanting, if the entire field is at that under those conditions, then using a lighter seeding rate than before, because we're just filling up for that gap, right? So like kind of cross-drilling at 30 to 40 maybe pounds per acre in western Kansas and maybe 40 to 60 pounds per acre in central and eastern Kansas, right? That is just going to fill up some of that stand. Now, if the problem is more targeted areas of the field, right? The growers go out there and see, okay, well, this entire part of my field did not come up and the seeds have perished. They're not coming up. Then they would replant that entire portion of the field at a higher seeding rate, right? So probably, again, at least bumping up their usual seeding rates by 10-15% for a week that we are past that optimum. So again, two situations. One, fields are uniformly thin, right? We'll go back with just like a recovery type of seeding rate, anywhere from 30 to 60 pounds, depending where we are in the state. Just kind of replant that cross-drilling at an angle to fill up that stand. In a different situation where whole portions of the field are bare and not coming up, then the recommendation will be to go there and replant using their original seeding rate plus 10 to 15% per week that we are past that optimal seeding date. One thing to keep in mind there, right, is that can be kind of concerning, especially next year, is in terms of weed control, right? Those gaps that we see in the field now, they provide weeds with more space and more resources in terms of light and water and less competition, right? And so chances are that we will be in weedier situations than we would if we had a good stand established. And so that's one challenge. Very likely we're going to get more weeds. But the other challenge is that if we have these parts of the field emerging at different times, these will translate into different growth stages of the crop as well. And some herbicides, they have some very clear cutoffs in terms of growth stage, right? So perhaps when it comes time in the spring when growers are applying, it may be too early for some of these late emergent crops, for some types of herbicides, right? Otherwise, if they wait too long, it might be too late for some of the crops that have emerged early. So it's going to be a little bit more challenging to get that weed control for those two reasons. First, more weeds. And second, just making sure that the timing for those different herbicide products match the growth stages that might be all over the place within the given field that's planted at two different times.
Romulo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby. Always good to visit with you.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. If you'd like to read more on replanting decisions, you can do so by checking out a recent Agronomy eUpdate article from October 31st. This article is titled Replanting Decisions for Winter Wheat. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find it for yourself by going to eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Again, that is eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we end our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, this past week, Kansas saw some rain.
Yeah, let's just take a moment and let's just soak it in. Enjoy it, because everyone in the state saw at least a quarter inch of rainfall, and the big winners were in the southeast, where they average more precipitation this time of year, but they had 5 to 6 inches of rain. And when we look at just the last 4 months for southeast Kansas, they've only had about 10 to 11 inches of rain, and over half of it came from just in the last week. So kind of when you think about Kansas climate as a whole, it averages out between the droughts and the floods, and we went literally from a drought to a flood in southeast Kansas. But thankfully, much needed precipitation across the entire region, and we had several rounds of beneficial moisture, and it didn't all fall heavily. Some of it fell pretty light over an extended period of time. Actually, most of it fell pretty light, and that allowed it to get soaked into the ground, too, so we didn't have huge runoff issues. Yes, we did get some heavier rains in the southeast that did lead to some of that flooding, but overall, for a majority of the state, just some really, really good shift in the weather pattern as we have a kind of stalled out low pressure system that's been parked to the southwest of Kansas, and it's still sitting there as continued rounds of moisture go into the western part of the state.
Were there parts of Kansas that saw a little bit of snow?
We finally got our first taste of snow in Kansas as Cheyenne County and Sherman County observed snow on Wednesday. In fact, they had to shut down I-70 for a while. While they only saw several inches of snow at the highest places, it was the first accumulating snow in Kansas for the year and a sign of winter is here. And just a kind of a reminder that we need to watch the forecast when we're traveling as we get towards the holiday season. Storms, while we haven't had a ton of snowstorms yet this year, the potential is there despite not having true significant cold. That we need to monitor the forecast and just be aware before we travel to check the forecast in other places that we're going to go to or that we drive through as well. You know, they kept seeing precipitation through eastern Colorado, eastern New Mexico as snow. In fact, some areas of the mountainous terrain are getting feet of snow along the Front Range. So a welcome change in the forecast for that region as well.
With this precipitation, did we see some positive drought monitor changes?
Of course, we saw a nice decrease in drought this week on the drought monitor, as that rain was very beneficial, especially the areas that saw around 1.5 to 2 inches, so somewhere around twice as much as the average precipitation. Those areas saw an improvement in the drought monitor, mainly from south central Kansas into northeast Kansas and eastward. And the improvements were, we eliminated the extreme drought that was in southeast Kansas that was introduced a couple weeks ago. But we cut down by over half the severe or worse drought coverage. We went from 32 of the state being in severe or worse drought down to just 11% of drought this week. And so some big improvements, and hopefully we can keep that momentum going to offset the dry conditions we've seen over the last 3 months.
Do we see moisture in our forecast, Chip?
As we look forward, the precipitation will taper off after Saturday when the storm system finally ejects north and east across Kansas Friday night into Saturday. It'll bring a really widespread amount of moisture. We could see most folks seeing around 3/4 of an inch, and some isolated areas, especially in south central Kansas, will likely see maybe inches, maybe in the way of 2 to 3 inches of moisture. So another round of precipitation. Things dry out as we get later in the weekend and we start to warm temperatures back up. Temperatures staying still despite cooler conditions. We're still consistently above normal. And we're going to carry the above normal temperatures really through the next 2 weeks. But the next storm, it looks like maybe the late next week, around the 14th, 15th of November. And again, it's going to have some tropical moisture to work with out of the Gulf. And the potential's there for maybe some widespread rainfall yet again. So we're keeping these chances of storms around and precipitation. It would be nice to spread some of these out, but we'll take the precipitation while we can get it.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us once again and give us our weather update.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.